I'm so proud of 1941 for another reason. I think 41 has the greatest miniatures since the Leyendecker days, since the old, Arnold Gillespie days of the great MGM miniatures from the 20s and 30s and 40s. And I think Greg Jean and his team of artisans and craftspeople and just, artists did the most amazing job recreating not only Pacific Ocean Park, but recreating Hollywood Boulevard with the Roosevelt Hotel and the Broadway and all the different buildings that were there in that era. They recreated on stage 16 at Warner Brothers, and Pacific Ocean Park was built, I think, on stage 30 at MGM Studios.
Hey!
Initially, we only built one Ferris wheel, and Matt Sweeney and his crew had it on like a marionette gimbal, where it was suspended by the hubs on an overhead track going over the pier itself. There was a cable that was dangling that hopefully you didn't see too much. That had to be wound around the Ferris wheel to give us power for the lights. And it just sort of kept going back and forth over the pier. What we had to rig on the pier, though, is since the Ferris wheel was about ½ inch above the surface, we rigged 2 parallel troughs with like 2 nail blades in them. So as the wheel was going down the pier, on the first take, I was running along the side, pulling a shiv and pulley that was pulling these troughs, breaking up all the little splinters. We arrived at MGM about 5:30 in the morning and rigged the Ferris wheel, and we probably started to roll camera about 9 o'clock, and everything was going well. Hit the water and went down, and there was cheering and hollering, but there was like, Stephen was standing there going like this, and we're like, uh-oh, what's going on? So after a conference, he came up and says, well, guys, how soon can you re-rig this Ferris wheel, because I want the lights to stay on under the water when it goes on, and I want a bigger explosion when it hits the water. So we were going crazy for about 4 hours, and about 2 o'clock we had straightened out what damage was done to the Ferris wheel, because it initially hit a little ring of primer cord and some of the metal was bent. And then we laminated resin over all these light bulbs up. We had to restring on the whole thing. And about 2:30 we shot it again, and it worked the way he wanted. It hit the water, there was a bigger splash, and it stayed lit as it went down. If they wanted a third take, I don't think we could have done it.
We loved the use of smoke in that picture, so I think we used it extensively. Smoke is not used for any kind of effect outside of when you use it for an effect, other than to create a texture, a feeling, an atmosphere visually, so that you set the mood of what you're doing in another area, only trying to suck the audience into what is happening. It helps you achieve a lot of the effects because it kind of diffuses the unreal part of we're trying to make real. We were concerned at some point that the smoke would be, because it was an oil smoke at that time, would drift and lay on top of the miniatures and create a sheen on the actual model that would give away the scale. So every now and then we had to go down and wipe everything off, wipe all the oil off. But nowadays they have a dry smoke that eliminates that problem completely. But in those days we had a rag crew out every morning just wiping everything down.
Miniature explosions is an effects man's nightmare because it's easy to create a large explosion, but to create an explosion that will match the scale of the miniatures is a lot more difficult.
In all the explosions, I ran a bunch of tests at 90 frames a second on putting primer cord inside of a balsa wood plywood structure and blowing it up. And it was, even at 90 frames a second, it was too fast and looked like a miniature. And I had this idea. which I don't think had ever been done before. And I said, how do we slow down an explosion? I want these explosions to be slower so we see more detail of the buildings blowing up. And I came up with this idea of using air mortars, that you would put the air mortar just below the stage floor and aimed only 4 or 5 inches away from the outer wall of the building you want to blow up. And then inside the air mortar, I put glitter, Christmas glitter, red and silver glitter, and little tiny pieces of balsa wood, which we call minutia, and mixed it all in there. And I thought we should put flash bulbs with different colors on the flash bulbs, orange, yellow, red, white flash bulbs, and trigger the flash bulbs at the moment the air mortar is exploding the walls out. So you had a backlit effect, so all the minutia would be backlit by these flashes. And then I could reduce my frame speed to about 45 frames a second instead of 60 or 90 frames a second. And all the explosions were done with air mortars. And I'm very proud of that because it really gave each explosion was much more detailed the way things blew up.
The large submarine miniature we made for 41 was crewed by Milius Roman, who was sort of an old world craftsman. And he made this thing, I think it was like 15 feet long. He did it with planks and spars, then we skinned it with foam and fiberglassed it, put ballast tanks in it. So it was actually sort of could have been a functioning little submarine. I think it wound up being used in Raiders of the Lost Ark later on. But the weirdest experience we had with it was in the tank, the Esther Williams tank at MGM, and somehow during the night, I think one of the studio people left the drain off the tank, and the tank wound up draining itself. The submarine was tethered to the side, and it just sort of, in the morning, it was like sort of twisted and broken. We had to like flood the tank again, fill it up, and do some emergency repairs to get it going. But it was like repairing a regular boat, just getting in there with fiberglass cloth and putting it all back together. A lot of things changed during the middle of production, like the scale of the miniatures. We started building them in one scale, a lot smaller, because we could get dollhouse material that was that size and etc. And then we did some camera tests and found out that it'd be nicer if they went half a size bigger. So it's like we made molds and patterns for the tanks and the planes in this smaller scale, and then wound up never using them at all and going to a bigger scale. We used forced perspective to get the most out of the shot because we were shooting in such a wide format. We could see things past the main street. So rather than go to the expense of building very expensive miniatures all the way through and not having enough room, we actually just sort of forced the perspective just past the first row of buildings. As a matter of fact, we used like 4 dozen cardboard boxes with holes cut in them as light boxes with transparencies or little toy dolls behind them. I remember we called all these furniture shops and tried to get all their refrigerator cartons we can and brought them over to the stage. Some people thought we were junk collectors. When it was decided we had to go down lower in the street, we had to come up with all these little miniature details to make the street look actually alive and lived in, since there were actually no people on the street. So we added a lot of little things like fire hydrants and newspaper racks and vendor stands and mailboxes and a lot of cars just to add some life to this barren street. The cars we carved out of foam and vacuum formed. I must have done about 36 of these 1940 Fords. Then we went over to like the local Savons and cleaned them out of all the little Barbie cars for the right wheels and just sort of tacked them together and taped them together very quickly. Some of them we actually put little RC units in, but because of the interference with different radio signals, the cars would like swerve out of, hit buildings and do other stuff. So a more safe method was came up with, and we used just strings, guys behind the buildings, just pulling strings at cue. Would yell like, car number 4, car number 5, car number 6. And then sometimes the camera cart, which was also very low on the ground shooting up, would react to this radio interference and just like cream the cars and cream half the buildings on the bottom and just crush a lot of stuff. But it was a pretty hit and miss thing half the time, but most of it worked out pretty good. A lot of people have brought up the fact that the buildings on Hollywood Boulevard aren't exactly where they're supposed to be. This was falls into the category of artistic license. The art department had built little maquettes and just said, well, let's do this because the plane looks better going by this thing on this side and going by this thing on the other side. but most of the people that hadn't been to Hollywood don't know. The San Fernando Valley set required us, well, we could have built anything, but we just decided to get drawings of what the actual streets were at the time, and we blew it up. And proportionally, we found out the houses were about that big. So we just went to the bandsaw and the table saw and just whacked out a whole bunch of houses that wound up being very much like Monopoly houses. And we had rubber stamps made with windows and doors on them, and we just painted them and stamped them on it, and we just had them all over the place. So yeah, I think a lot of people took them home for Monopoly sets. I've been very fortunate in my working with Steven in that the first film I'd worked on, Close Encounters, I got an Oscar nomination with Doug Trumbull and all the other folks there. And then on 41, we were fortunate enough to get another Oscar nomination, myself with A.D. Flowers and Bill Fraker, and I'm just tickled pink about that.